They laughed. Not just the enemy pilots with their elegant Messerschmitts and svelte Focke-Wulfs, but even some of our own. Men in flight jackets leaning against the cold metal of hangar walls, engineers in rumpled shirts, who hid their doubts behind nervous grins. When the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt first rolled onto the airfields of America and England, it seemed the punchline to a cruel joke. A plane so massive and ungainly, some swore it must have been a mistake. Axis intelligence intercepted the first reports and snickered. They called it the milk jug. Fat, slow, and surely no threat to their beloved Luftwaffe. Allied pilots, more familiar with the graceful lines of the Spitfire or the hard-charging P-51, eyed the jug with skepticism, whispering that it was a flying tractor, a beast better suited for towing gliders than for dogfights over Europe. Commanders grumbled about wasted metal, and politicians demanded results. In mess halls and briefings, in quiet corners and smoky back rooms, the laughter echoed. What the critics didn't see, what they couldn't see, was what lay beneath the jug's hulking frame. 8 gleaming Browning .50 caliber machine guns packed like a row of clenched fists. An engine that roared with the fury of American industry, built to shrug off bullets and belch fire at 30,000 feet. The pilots assigned to fly her felt the weight of the world pressing down. Not only would they have to face the best pilots the Reich could throw at them, they would have to do it in a machine no one believed in. Some men took it personally. Letters home tell of pilots joking about bringing anvils to a knife fight. But in private, doubt gnawed at them. One recalled the first time he climbed into the jug's cockpit. Like saddling a bull, he wrote. All muscle, stubbornness, and none of it wanted to listen. Mechanics learned to curse in new languages as they battled with the plane's size and quirks. From the ground, the jug seemed to lumber and roll, a lumbering giant forever a step behind its faster, sleeker cousins. The laughter was loudest from the Luftwaffe. German pilots would spot the P-47 lumbering across the channel and radio to their wingmen. "Here come the flying barns!" They dove in for the kill, confident, cocky, certain they'd bag another easy victory. They had no idea that the joke was about to be on them, because every war has its turning point, and every legend its origin story. The P-47s looked nothing like triumph in the beginning. It looked like another failed experiment, destined for the scrap heap or, worse, a legacy of sending brave men to their deaths. But beneath the laughter, the mockery, and the doubt, a fire was kindling, a spark of American stubbornness, a belief that sometimes the ugliest duckling becomes the fiercest predator. War, after all, doesn't care about appearances. The sky is an unforgiving judge, and the only thing that matters at 10,000 feet is what you bring to the fight. The jug would soon show the world what it truly carried. And so, as laughter rolled through the halls of command, across Allied and Axis camps alike, it seeped into the very walls of Republic Aviation's design rooms. The men and women there heard the mockery as a challenge, not a condemnation. Each jeer became a dare, each dismissive remark a reason to dig deeper. Because somewhere between derision and desperation, greatness can be forged. If only someone is willing to bet on the beast. They all laughed until the day the skies rained fire. But that day was coming, and the world would never forget it. The echoes of laughter now faded into anxious silence as engineers and pilots braced themselves for the next chapter. Somewhere in the chaos of blueprints and battle plans, the future was being built. One rivet, one test flight, one determined heart at a time. What the world didn't know was that the jug's story was only just beginning. Every legend starts as a punchline, and in the winter of 1940, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was the butt of every joke in the aviation world. While war thundered across Europe and the skies became a proving ground for the very soul of nations, inside the modest halls of Republic Aviation in Farmingdale, New York, a small team of engineers toiled beneath the fluorescent lights, their shoulders weighted by the impossible. Alexander Kartveli, a Georgian immigrant with a restless mind and fire behind his eyes, led the project. He had seen what the Luftwaffe could do, had pored over reports from the RAF, and understood that America would need something more than beauty and bravado. But what he dreamed up was radical. A hulking, heavy fighter, with a massive radial engine and a thick fuselage, more akin to a flying fortress than the sleek interceptors beloved by pilots and press alike. When the first blueprints leaked, laughter rolled through the Pentagon and the factory floors alike. "This thing'll never get off the ground," muttered one Air Corps officer, shaking his head. In the mess halls, pilots passed around hand-drawn cartoons of the Jug as a flying cow, stubby wings flapping in protest. Mechanics groaned when they saw the size of the Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine, nicknaming it the Barrel for its size and temperamental nature. Even veteran test pilots, men who had risked death a dozen times over, eyed the Thunderbolt's stubby wings and wondered if their luck had finally run out. Yet necessity has a way of demanding the impossible. The early days of World War II had shattered illusions. In 1939, the Germans sliced through Poland and France with terrifying speed, and the Luftwaffe's Messerschmitts seemed unstoppable. America's best, planes like the P-40 Warhawk and P-39 Airacobra, were already outclassed, barely holding the line in distant skies. The British Spitfire was a miracle, yes, but there were never enough to go around. Kartveli and his engineers were under no illusions. The Air Corps wanted a high-altitude escort, a fighter that could not only take a pounding but give one right back. "Build us a war winner," they said, "and make it soon." With every setback, the jokes grew louder. The first prototypes were overweight, plagued with cooling issues, and almost impossible to land on short runways. Flight after flight ended with a busted tire, a sheared landing gear, or an engine that howled like a banshee. The paperwork stacked higher. Congressional committees wanted answers, and generals, many of whom saw their careers hanging in the balance, looked for scapegoats. Political pressure seeped into every meeting. Production quotas, factory delays, and materials shortages bred frustration. One by one, engineers on the project were called into closed-door sessions, asked to justify every bolt and rivet. "We're not building a bomber," one senator scoffed after reviewing the specs. "This thing belongs in a zoo, not a dogfight." Even the paint scheme became a point of contention. Early models looked drab, hulking, and uninspired, like gray ghosts lumbering on the assembly line. For the pilots, the arrival of the Jug was an insult. Those who had flown the svelte P-51 Mustang or the agile Spitfire felt they were being punished, handed a beast better suited to hauling cargo than hunting Messerschmitts. A young lieutenant from Texas, newly assigned to fly the Thunderbolt, wrote home in exasperation, "I wanted to be an eagle. They made me a bull." Some tried to wriggle out of their assignments, hoping for a transfer before their first test flight. In those early days, the phrase P-47 pilot was said with a smirk, as if it marked a man destined for disappointment or disaster. The problems seemed endless. In high-altitude trials, the cockpit would ice over, leaving pilots blinded and fumbling for controls. The heavy frame made tight turns nearly impossible. Ground crews discovered oil leaks the size of puddles beneath every engine. Engineers reworked wing designs and fuel systems, trading sleep for a chance at redemption. For every improvement, two more issues appeared, and the laughter, now tinged with pity, never seemed to fade. Yet even in the darkest hours, Kartveli would not yield. He prowled the factory floor, barking encouragement, cajoling designers, and poring over blueprints with sleepless intensity. He insisted that the engine, for all its size, would be a blessing, not a curse, that the thick armor would save lives when the war got bloody. He pointed to the Jug's gun ports, 8 in all, bristling with 50 caliber Browning machine guns, and declared, "This is what will turn the tide." But outside his circle, skepticism reigned. Test pilots gathered in the evening to swap horror stories, laughing about the flying milk can and the battle cow. Mechanics tossed coins to see who would have to coax the engine to life at dawn. Journalists took one look and filed their stories under also-rans, certain that the P-47 would be another expensive failure, another dashed hope in a war full of them. What no one realized, what no one could possibly predict, was how all those flaws would, under the right circumstances, become assets. The Jug's thick skin would soon deflect cannon shells that tore other fighters apart. Its weight, once derided, would make it the perfect dive bomber. The R-2800 engine, coaxed and cursed into reliability, would roar above the clouds with a power and durability unmatched by anything the enemy could muster. But all that was still ahead. In the meantime, every headline, every joke, every sideways glance became another test of will. The men and women behind the Jug pressed on, convinced that somewhere beneath the ridicule there was greatness waiting to be revealed. What the world saw was a punchline. What they saw, what they prayed for, was the chance to prove them all wrong. As the war in Europe grew more desperate, and as casualty lists mounted, the laughter began to die down. In the spring of 1942, new orders came in, stark, urgent, impossible to ignore. The brass had spoken. "Get it airborne, or we lose the war." In that moment, everything changed. The birth of a mockery became the crucible of destiny. The Thunderbolt's journey had truly begun. The sky became a proving ground, and the P-47 Thunderbolt, mocked, doubted, and nearly cast aside, was about to meet its fate. In March 1943, as icy winds swept across the battered airfields of England, the first Jugs rolled out, heavy with promise and uncertainty. No fanfare greeted these machines, just a grim silence as ground crews fueled their bellies and pilots checked their gear, hearts pounding with a mixture of hope and resignation. The 56th Fighter Group was among the first to receive the new birds. They were a tough, close-knit bunch, forged by training accidents and too many funerals. As orders arrived to escort B-17s deep into occupied France, rumors swirled. Some called it a suicide mission. The Luftwaffe ruled the skies beyond the Channel, and every American pilot knew the fate of those who fell behind enemy lines. Yet orders were orders, and the Jugs, ready or not, were the only game in town. Pre-dawn darkness shrouded the airfield as engines rumbled to life. Inside the cockpits, men tightened their gloves, clipped pictures of sweethearts to the dash, and forced bravado into their voices. "Don't worry, boys," one veteran shouted. "If we run out of fuel, we'll just bounce down the Autobahn." Nervous laughter barely hid the fear. For all their size, the Thunderbolts felt like thin shells between life and oblivion. Takeoff was an ordeal. Pilots heaved on the stick, coaxing the heavy machines into the gray English sky, watching oil pressure gauges twitch and praying for steady revs. Below, mechanics watched anxiously, hats in hands, aware that any engine hiccup could spell disaster. The radio chatter was thick with bravado, thinly veiled panic riding every syllable. Crossing the Channel, the formation tightened. Sunlight burned through the clouds, glinting off the Jug's thick wings. The world below was a patchwork of green and brown, the roads crawling with enemy convoys. Up ahead, dark specks gathered, Luftwaffe fighters, shark-nosed and deadly, hungry for another easy kill. Contact came quickly and violently. The enemy dove from the sun, cannons blazing, and all hell broke loose. Pilots snapped into combat drills, brake left, dive, roll. But the Jugs, heavy and unproven, struggled to keep up. For all their firepower, The Thunderbolts could not turn with the nimble Messerschmitts. In those first desperate seconds, dreams of glory vanished, replaced by the raw animal urge to survive. Gunfire shattered canopies. Oil sprayed across windscreens. Radios filled with shouted warnings, curses, and the cold finality of Mayday calls. "I'm hit, going down!" someone cried. Another, "Where's my wingman?" "He's gone. I've lost him." Parachutes bloomed in the thin air, hopes hanging by silk threads. Ground controllers listened helplessly as chaos reigned. The Jug's thick armor did save some lives, bullets sparking harmlessly off cowling and cockpit. But for every pilot who made it back, another vanished behind enemy lines, their fate a grim secret whispered only by the burning wrecks on French soil. The Luftwaffe's radio intercepts buzzed with glee. The American battle cows had come, and they had failed. First-hand accounts painted a picture of confusion and heartbreak. Lieutenant Sam "Red" Connors wrote in his diary, "We felt like cannon fodder. Every maneuver was a struggle. I saw Tommy's Jug take fire and spiral out of control. By the time I circled back, he was gone." Back at base, survivors climbed from battered cockpits, faces gray and hollow. Engineers counted bullet holes, patched torn wings, and replaced blown tires in silence. Mess halls were quiet, the bravado gone. Commanders pored over reports, searching for answers. Why so many were lost? Why the Thunderbolt seemed to fall short of every promise? Yet not every story was a tragedy. For all their struggles, some pilots found slivers of hope. The Jug's toughness became legend even in those bleak days. Lieutenant Ed Ford limped home with half a wing missing, oil pouring from a dozen holes, yet somehow the plane held together. Another pilot took a 20mm shell straight through the fuselage. He landed safely, shaking but alive. The Luftwaffe, flush with victory, grew bolder. Radio chatter from German pilots dripped with contempt. "The Americans send cattle to the slaughter," one ace quipped. "Soon they will run out of bulls." Allied command braced for the worst, contemplating whether to pull the Jugs from frontline service entirely. But in the darkness of those first losses, something began to change. A few pilots refused to quit. They gathered after missions, huddling over maps, replaying every maneuver, every error. They swapped tactics, invented new formations, learned the Jug's strengths and limitations. The plane was not agile, but it could dive faster than anything in the sky. Its guns, when unleashed in unison, chewed through armor and flesh with horrifying effect. Flight crews worked through the nights, tweaking engines, shaving ounces from fuselages, inventing modifications on the fly. Engineers returned to their blueprints, swallowing pride and seeking advice from the very men who risked everything in the cockpit. Across bases, a stubborn resolve settled in. The war wasn't lost yet, and neither was the Thunderbolt. Through the haze of defeat and doubt, tiny victories flickered. Pilots who survived began to trust their machines, understanding that brute force could be an asset. "The Jug won't dance," said one, "but she'll take a punch and hand it right back." Each mission became a laboratory, each mistake a lesson hard-won in blood and fear. In that bleak spring, the sky above Europe was littered with dreams and wreckage. Some men would never return, their fates sealed by the bitter lessons of war. But for those who dared to climb back into the cockpit, a new fire took hold, a determination to adapt, to fight, to prove that legends are born not in ease, but in the crucible of failure. As darkness settled once more over the airfields, the laughter of the enemy echoed faintly. Somewhere in the night, a handful of pilots gathered by the wing of a battered Jug, eyes scanning the horizon, unwilling to surrender. In silence and resolve, they prepared to fly again, determined that the next chapter would not be written in defeat. They were mocked for their planes, but their courage made legends. The airfields of England, scarred by rain and the deep rumble of departing engines, became more than mere launching grounds for war. They became a second home, a forge where boys from all corners of America and the wider world were tempered into something stronger than steel. The men assigned to the P-47 squadrons hailed from the wheat fields of Kansas, the factories of New York, the dusty stretches of Texas, and the crowded boroughs of Chicago. Some had never seen the ocean before the war, let alone imagined themselves flying thousands of feet above it in a roaring machine. Lieutenant Paul "Tiny" Harrison, a farm kid from Iowa, wrote to his mother nearly every week, though he tried to hide the worst of it. "The food's better than I expected, Ma, and the boys here are good men," he'd write, leaving out the terror of the night raids, or the way his hands shook after every mission. Across the bunks, Red Connors, city-born and quick-witted, scribbled jokes and drew cartoons of his own, always finding humor in the most desperate of moments. His letters to his little sister in Boston were full of tall tales and mischief, but she would later admit she always read between the lines. He was scared, and so were all of them. Between sorties, the airmen lived on a knife edge. Some coped by swapping stories and cigarettes, trading rumors about promotions or the best pubs in London. Others brooded in silence, haunted by empty bunks and names that faded from the chalkboard with each passing week. They learned to grieve quietly, to smile through the loss, to invent rituals of remembrance. Letters written to fathers who would never read them. Toasts raised for the fallen, and nicknames spoken in reverence at dawn. It was a brotherhood stitched together by the daily risk of death, by shared meals and stolen hours of sleep, by the bone-deep understanding that any man beside you could be gone tomorrow. For many, the jug was both a symbol of their burden and a source of pride. The pilots still grumbled about her size and quirks, but they also named their aircraft with painted pin-ups and slogans. Iowa Rose, Big Red's Beauty, Sky Wrangler. To them, the Thunderbolt became an extension of self, a stubborn, loyal beast whose scars mirrored their own. Sometimes, in the quiet moments before dawn, they'd gather at the edge of the runway, staring out into the low, gray fog. One would light a cigarette, another would crack a crude joke, and for a few minutes the war felt distant, just the sound of engines warming, and the knowledge that they faced it together. There was fear, always, but fear, shared and spoken aloud, lost some of its sting. They learned the difference between courage and bravado. Courage was climbing back into a battered jug after watching a friend go down. Bravado was just noise in the mess hall. As losses mounted, the weight grew heavier. The empty bunks multiplied, and each returning pilot carried a little more silence in his eyes. They mourned in their own ways, some with fits of anger, others with grim determination, a few by writing their goodbyes in journals they'd never send. Yet every loss knit the survivors closer, and in that closeness was strength. Through the worst of it, letters home became lifelines. They were careful not to worry their families, glossing over missions and air battles with the language of adventure. But mothers and sweethearts knew, reading between the lines. One letter, found in a fallen pilot's jacket, read, "Don't fret, I'll be home before the corn's high, and I'll bring you a bit of French lace. But if I don't make it, tell Pa I did my best. The jug and I are getting along, and the boys here, well, they're brothers now. The bonds extended beyond nationality and background. British ground crews, Polish pilots, Canadians and Australians, each brought a piece of their world to the muddy fields of East Anglia. Language barriers fell before the universal currency of fear, laughter, and loss. They celebrated birthdays, mourned anniversaries of friends lost back home, shared coffee and contraband whiskey under blackout curtains, each moment precious, because it could be their last. Loyalty became their armor. No man was left behind willingly. If a jug was shot down and a parachute spotted, pilots circled the area, marking the spot, risking enemy fire to radio the location. When one of their own failed to return, the grief was sharp, but so was the resolve to fly again, to prove their worth, to avenge a brother. They became experts at hiding their scars, at laughing through the ache, at pushing forward when every instinct screamed to run. It was in this crucible of hardship and hope that their tactics evolved. The pilots of the Jug, forced to adapt, became innovators. They learned to exploit the Thunderbolt's strengths, to dive away from trouble, to unleash 8 guns at once in a thundering barrage, to protect each other's tails with tight formations and radio discipline. The bond between men and machine deepened. The Jug, once a punchline, became a shield, a weapon, and, for some, a final resting place. As the days bled into months, a new spirit emerged among the P-47 squadrons, a stubborn pride in their battered, belittled aircraft and in each other. They wore their scars openly, with a kind of defiant joy, knowing they had survived what others could only imagine. They were mocked for their planes, but their courage made legends. And as their brotherhood grew, so too did their mastery of the Jug. In the cockpit and on the ground, they found new strength, not just in steel and fire, but in the unbreakable bonds forged above the clouds. Now, as the war raged on, those bonds and that battered machine would be put to the ultimate test. The Jug pilots had learned to trust each other and their thunderous steeds. Next, they would teach the enemy to fear them. The day laughter died came with the thunder of 8 guns blazing through the European sky. If the P-47 Thunderbolt had earned little more than ridicule in its first months, that scorn was about to be swallowed by awe and fear. For beneath its thick skin and awkward lines, the Jug hid a secret that would redraw the map of air combat: the devastating, unrelenting firepower of 8 50-caliber Browning machine guns. In the spring of 1943, after months of losses and slow learning, a new directive swept through the Thunderbolt squadrons. No more half measures, no more caution. The pilots, bruised by combat and burned by loss, were told to do what no other plane in the American arsenal could: bring every ounce of the Jug's firepower to bear, all at once. They called it wall-to-wall lead. In the training rooms, instructors hammered the new tactics home. Hit fast, hit hard, hit with everything you've got. Technicians checked and rechecked every gun. They made sure the belts were packed with armor-piercing rounds, that each Browning was tuned to perfection. The 50 caliber, big, brutal, reliable, had already earned its place as the backbone of American firepower. But no fighter, before or since, had mounted 8 of them in a single volley. On the ground crews watched pilots practice strafing runs, their fingers itching at the thought of what those guns could do to a convoy, a train, or an enemy fighter caught unaware. For the pilots, the transformation was as much mental as mechanical. They'd learned the Jug couldn't outturn the Luftwaffe's best, but with altitude and a touch of patience, they could dive like a falling anvil and, for a few fateful seconds, become the deadliest predator in the sky. The plan? Climb high, wait for the Germans to make their move, then roll, dive, and let those 850s do the talking. On a brisk morning in May, the chance arrived. B-17s lumbered towards their target, black flak blooming around them. The escorting Jugs formed a loose shield, nerves stretched tight. Above, German pilots circled, hungry for an easy kill, confident, cocky, laughing on the radio. They closed in, expecting the same clumsy resistance as before. But when the first Messerschmitt dove for the bombers, Lieutenant Red Connors was ready. He rolled his Jug, throttled forward, and dove at full speed, the wind howling through the airframe. At 500 yards, he squeezed the trigger. The nose of the P-47 lit up, flames licking from all 8 barrels, smoke curling from the wings, and a torrent of lead tearing through the sky. It was an unholy noise, a sound pilots would later say you could feel in your bones. Enemy fighters that had sneered at the Jug's bulk suddenly found themselves in a hurricane of bullets, shells ripping through wings and engines, shattering plexiglass and metal. One German pilot, who survived a close encounter, described it simply: "I thought the sky had opened, and hell had come out." Radio intercepts from the day tell the story better than any after-action report. "Achtung, Achtung! Amerikaner mit 8 Kanonen. 8 Kanonen!" The disbelief and rising panic in the German voices were unmistakable. On Allied channels, the tone changed, too. A spark of hope. The first taste of real payback. On the ground, intelligence officers listened to the chaos. Tape reels spun, catching voices that had once mocked the Thunderbolt, now filled with fear and frantic orders. Archival footage from gun cameras captured the reality. Streams of fire lancing through enemy formations, trains exploding in geysers of steam and shrapnel, convoys left smoking and shattered on country roads. In interviews years later, surviving Jug pilots would recall the first time they saw a Messerschmitt simply disintegrate under their guns, pieces tumbling earthward in a cloud of oil and flame. Back at base, stories spread like wildfire. "You could see daylight through their wings," one mechanic said, awestruck. Another recalled a Jug limping home with enemy bullets stitched along the fuselage, but its own guns still hot from firing. Proof that the tables had turned. The ground crews, once skeptics, now watched their pilots return with pride, counting bullet holes not in dread, but in admiration. The P-47's firepower didn't just change the score in dogfights, it changed the very tactics of the air war. German pilots, once eager to tangle with the slow battle cows, now approached with caution or not at all. Luftwaffe doctrine began to shift. No longer did they attack head-on, not when 850s waited to shred them. Instead, they hunted for stragglers, avoided direct confrontation, and radioed desperate warnings to their comrades. Beware the Jug. Allied strategy shifted too. The Thunderbolt became not just an escort, but a scourge of anything that moved on the ground. Trains, tanks, trucks, nothing was safe. Missions were planned with the Jug's strengths in mind. High-altitude sweeps, diving attacks, lightning-fast strafing runs. In debriefings, pilots began to boast, not about acrobatics, but about the sheer destructive power at their fingertips. For the men in the cockpit, the feeling was electric. The days of dread, of being cannon fodder, faded with every mission. They watched enemy aces break away, rather than face the Jug head-on. Confidence, once a fragile thing, became a weapon of its own. The men started to believe not just in their aircraft, but in themselves. They no longer feared laughter. They invited it, knowing what waited for anyone who underestimated the Jug. Personal accounts from the time paint the transformation in vivid detail. Lieutenant Harrison, once doubter, now true believer, wrote to his mother, "The boys used to laugh when they saw our planes. Today, we sent 8 Messerschmitts spinning to Earth. The noise of all 8 guns is like thunder itself. When we hit, nothing walks away." Enemy interrogations would later confirm it. Captured German pilots confessed they dreaded the 8 Kanonen, 8 guns. They whispered of comrades who never saw what hit them, of squadrons that vanished in moments. Fear crept into enemy briefings, a cold shadow where mockery once stood. It was not just hardware and gunmetal that turned the tide. It was the spirit of the men who had refused to quit, who had learned the hard way what their machine could do. The Jug's guns became a legend, but it was the heart behind the trigger that wrote the story. And as battle reports flooded in from France, Belgium, and beyond, it was clear. Something fundamental had changed. The war in the air was now a different fight. Laughter faded, replaced by respect and fear. But change brings new challenges, and with each victory came new orders, new missions, and higher stakes. As the world took note, the men of the Jug squadrons braced themselves for what would come next, knowing their work and their trials were far from over. German pilots once joked about the Jug. Now they whisper warnings. By the summer of 1943, the winds above Europe had changed. Once, German aces bragged about chasing down American flying barns, their laughter crackling across radio frequencies and echoing in mess halls. But as the months wore on, laughter faded into uneasy silence. Stories spread among the Luftwaffe, stories that grew with every mission. 8 Kanonen, 8 guns, thunder and ruin. The Jug's legend, once a punchline, was now a warning hissed before each sortie. For the first time, fear moved faster than rumor. The transformation was sudden and staggering. The men of the Thunderbolt squadrons, once doubted and derided, became the architects of devastation. High above France, Belgium, and the Low Countries, the Jug painted its legacy in gunfire, smoke, and the twisted wreckage of the Reich's war machine. The Germans, masters of blitzkrieg and dominance in the sky, found themselves stalked by a new predator, one that didn't hunt with elegance, but with overwhelming force and stubborn resolve. It was on the long daylight raids, deep into German-occupied territory, that the Thunderbolt came into its own. The B-17s and B-24s, vital to the Allied bombing campaign, lumbered eastward in tight formations, prime targets for prowling enemy fighters and a swarming sea of flak. In the past, Luftwaffe aces had picked off bombers almost at leisure, their Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs diving through the bomber streams, rolling away before defenders could react. But that era was over. Now, as the bombers crossed the channel, silver specks swept ahead and behind, Jug squadrons flying high and heavy, scanning the clouds. When the enemy attacked, the Thunderbolts responded with disciplined violence. Outnumbered, they dove, rolling into the attack, unleashing the full fury of their 8 Brownings. Enemy formations shattered under the hail. Sometimes, the Jugs broke up entire attacks before a single bomber was touched. For the German pilots, it was a rude awakening. Reports from the front lines tell the story best. Sudden, blinding bursts of tracer fire, the shock of armor-piercing rounds tearing through wings and fuselages, the impossible sound of so many guns at once. Survivors landed, pale and shaken, recounting how friends had vanished in sheets of flame and debris. "I saw only a flash," one pilot recalled, "and then my wingman was gone." Allied command, hungry for good news, seized on every story. The morale in the bomber crews, once brittle, now hardening, soared when they saw Jugs battling at their side. No longer did they watch helplessly as enemy fighters slashed through their ranks. Now, they saw the Jug as their shield, a guardian angel with the teeth of a tiger. The impact was not only felt in the skies. As the Allies advanced, they realized the Jug's brute strength could be used in ways no designer had imagined. Ground attack became its specialty, a role born of necessity, refined by innovation. The Thunderbolt, able to shrug off small arms fire and flak, dove on enemy columns, convoys, and trains with an appetite for destruction. Pilots returned from sorties with stories that seemed impossible. Captain Red Connors described his first train attack. "We came in low, hugging the trees. The train tried to run, but it couldn't outrun us. 8 guns and rockets tore it apart. Cars flipped like toys, steam and fire everywhere. I never imagined a plane could do that." Allied intelligence soon mapped the damage. Rail yards twisted into tangles of blackened steel, bridges blown to rubble, supply lines crippled for weeks at a time. German soldiers, once bold in their convoys, began to scatter at the distant growl of a Jug's engine. Convoy guards scanned the skies in terror, weapons at the ready, but few were brave enough to face the Jug head-on. Villagers across occupied Europe whispered about the American planes that arrived with the sun, their silver wings glinting, their guns roaring. Sometimes they cheered as German tanks burst into flames. Sometimes they mourned when a jug failed to climb away, falling in a plume of smoke among the fields. Even so, hope began to blossom where there had only been fear. But for the pilots, the war was still a grinding, perilous gauntlet. Each mission was a razor's edge. One mistake, one burst of flak, and a name was erased from the roster. Yet the sense of purpose grew stronger with every sortie. The Jug was no longer just an airplane. It was a symbol. Every pilot who strapped in carried the knowledge that he was part of a turning tide. One squadron commander wrote to his wife, "I don't know if I'll make it home, but I know why we're here. We're breaking their backs day by day. The Jug does the work no one else can." The Germans responded with desperation. They reinforced their airfields, sent up more fighters, tried new tactics. But their confidence was shaken. Enemy briefings began with warnings about Thunderbolts. Avoid direct engagement. Beware the dive. Never attack from behind. If you see a Jug, break off and live to fight another day, went the new refrain. Intercepted communications revealed the growing dread. Achtung! Thunderbolts attacking at low altitude. Losses heavy. Request reinforcements. The Luftwaffe's best, once lionized, now wondered if their luck had run out. As autumn bled into winter, the Thunderbolt's impact was felt across every front. In Italy, the Balkans, and soon, in the heart of Germany itself, the Jug prowled the skies. It tore through armor, demolished bridges, and hunted trains with merciless precision. The sound of its engine, once a source of derision, now sent shivers down spines from Normandy to the Ruhr. Allied air crews began to carry a swagger, a hard-won confidence born of survival and success. In the mess halls, new pilots listened with awe to the stories of veterans. How a single Jug held off a dozen enemies. How convoys disappeared in fire and chaos. How the laughter had died and fear had taken its place. The war was still hell, but now the Allies had a weapon that matched their will. A war correspondent embedded with the 56th Fighter Group wrote, "You can see the shift in their eyes. The old fear is there, but it's different now. A hunger, a sense that they're part of something unstoppable. The Jug pilots have learned what their machine can do, and the enemy knows it too." All along the front, battle reports flooded Allied command. Bombers returned with fewer holes. Convoys were destroyed. Bridges lost. The narrative had shifted. Where the Jug was once doubted, it was now depended upon, celebrated, even envied by those flying lesser machines. And yet, the price was steep. The Jug's dominance meant more missions, deeper targets, and higher stakes. The pilots pressed on, driven by duty, by loyalty to their brothers, by the knowledge that they were, at last, turning the tide. The laughter of the enemy had become a memory. In its place, a new sound rose over Europe. The rumble of the Jug's engine, the hammering of its guns, and the whispered warnings of those who once mocked, now humbled by fire. Suddenly, the Jug was a name spoken with fear and respect. The air war's momentum was shifting, but with every victory, the burden grew heavier. The men who carried the Thunderbolt's legacy would soon discover that legends are forged not just in triumph, but in the sacrifices made along the way. For every joke, 1,000 scars. For every laugh, a new hero is born. The Jug's reputation grew not only from its power, but from the men who flew her. Ordinary boys transformed by fear, loss, and duty into legends living on the edge of oblivion. The air war over Europe was a crucible. Each day, acts of courage and sacrifice forged new myths, written not in newspapers, but in the battered fuselages and battered hearts of those who survived. In the winter of 1944, with the Allies pressing deeper into occupied territory, The days blurred into a relentless grind of sorties and repairs, dawn takeoffs and dusk landings, each mission a gamble. For the pilots, every return to the air was an act of faith. The sky above France and the Low Countries was littered with burned-out hulks and broken dreams, a warning to all who followed. One story, passed between crews in the freezing dark, became a touchstone for everything the Jug and its pilots stood for. Lieutenant Jack Ransom, 24, son of a Pennsylvania coal miner, had already survived more missions than most would ever see. He was known for his quick grin and steadiness under fire, a man who made every new recruit feel like they belonged. On the morning of January 11th, Ransom and his squadron were assigned to support a bomber run near the Ardennes, a routine job that turned into a legend. The sky was thick with cloud and menace as the formation neared the target area. German flak blossomed around them, black puffs marking invisible walls. Suddenly, a swarm of Focke-Wulf 190s erupted from the sun, diving into the formation. The bombers scattered, and the Jug pilots banked into the attack. Ransom's plane rocked violently as shrapnel tore through his right wing. He steadied, squeezed the trigger, and let loose the Jug's 8 guns. Tracers lit the sky, punching holes through a German fighter. The enemy pilot bailed out, his chute billowing behind as he tumbled away. But there was no time to celebrate. Another Focke-Wulf latched onto Ransom's tail, cannons spitting death. "Mayday! Mayday! Ransom! I'm hit!" His voice crackled through the radio, tight with pain but unbroken. Smoke poured from his engine, oil splattering the canopy. He pulled hard, feeling the stick go slack, the Jug's nose dropping as power bled away. In that moment, everything slowed. The chaos, the fear, the frantic voices on the radio. Ransom remembered his father's words. "Son, never give up on a good machine. She'll never give up on you." With one hand clamped to the throttle and the other wiping blood from his eye, Ransom dove. The Jug, wounded but stubborn, responded. German pilots circled, eager for the kill. Ransom kicked the rudder, squeezed every last ounce of speed, and pointed the Jug at the treetops. Behind him, the radio lit up with shouts. "Get out, Jack! Bail out!" But he stayed, fighting the controls, refusing to let the Jug fall. Tracer rounds stitched the air. Another pass, more holes in the wing, metal shrieking. Yet somehow, the old bird held together. At treetop level, Ransom jinked and dodged, using the Jug's weight and momentum to his advantage. The German fighters, hungry and overconfident, dove in. Ransom waited, then yanked the stick, rolling into a split S. The pursuing Focke-Wulf overshot, and with a last gasp of power, Ransom pressed the trigger. The 8 Brownings roared one final time. The German exploded in a ball of flame. Now almost out of fuel, controls sluggish, Ransom pointed the Jug toward friendly lines. For long, excruciating minutes, he flew on willpower alone, watching the gauges drop, the engines sputtering. On the ground, his squadron listened, praying for a voice, a sign. At last, battered and burning, the Jug appeared over the airfield. Ransom radioed, his voice ragged. "Coming in hot. Clear the strip." Ground crews scrambled as he brought the crippled fighter in, landing hard, skidding, finally stopping at the field's edge. Smoke poured from the engine as the canopy burst open. Ransom, alive, staggered out. His uniform torn, his face streaked with grime and sweat, but his eyes fierce with triumph. That night, the mess hall was quieter than usual. No cheers, no rowdy stories, just Ransom's battered flight jacket hanging on a nail, and a sense among the men that they'd witnessed something sacred. The mechanics counted over 170 bullet holes in the Jug's battered skin. The ground chief simply ran a hand along the fuselage and said, "Tough old girl." Toughest I ever saw. Ransom was back in the air within days. But something had shifted. Not just for him, but for every man who heard his story. The jug, so often mocked, was now a lifeline, a partner that might just carry them through hell and back. His wasn't the only story of the day. There were others, of pilots crash-landing in enemy territory, evading capture for weeks with the help of the French resistance, of wingmen circling downed friends, refusing to leave until the last possible moment, of engineers inventing repairs on the fly, stitching wings with tape and hope. Each tale wove another thread into the legend. Some were stories of sacrifice, too, of men who never made it home, whose jugs went down in flames, whose names became just another inscription on a marble wall. For every triumphant return, there were bunks left empty, meals uneaten, families waiting for letters that would never come. The cost of glory was measured not only in victories, but in the wounds that never fully healed. But in the smoke and chaos, a kind of redemption glimmered. Pilots who had doubted themselves, who had faced the worst and survived, found new strength. The jug's resilience became their own. The same brute force that had inspired ridicule now inspired awe. Even German interrogators, after the war, admitted that the jug pilots had earned their respect. They were stubborn, those Thunderbolt boys. They would not run, no matter how badly we hit them. As the campaign ground on, the pilots of the Thunderbolt squadrons flew with a new sense of destiny. They painted fresh names on their planes, memorials to lost friends and promises to themselves. Some took to carrying lucky charms, a patch from a fallen comrade, a photograph, a letter folded tight and tucked under a seat. These small tokens became talismans against fate. For every joke, 1,000 scars. For every laugh, a new hero was born. The jug was more than a machine now. It was a symbol of what men could endure and what they could become when everything was on the line. Not all stories end in glory. The price of victory is heavy, and every new day brought fresh risks, new wounds, and the certainty that the sky's favor was never guaranteed. Yet the jug pilots pressed on, forging their legend with every mission. One close call, one sacrifice, one hard-won triumph at a time. Victory demands sacrifice. Who pays the price when legends are made? Behind every story of thunder and fire, every act of heroism in the sky, there was another story unfolding, quieter, lonelier, far from the headlines and the adulation of mess halls. War did not pause for the broken-hearted or the brave. It only kept moving forward, tallying its debts in names never spoken again, and seats left empty at dinner tables thousands of miles from the front. As the months dragged on and the jug's reputation grew, so too did the cost. In England, the rhythm of the airfields was marked not only by roaring engines and returning victors, but by the hush that followed when a plane didn't come back. Pilots joked about luck and fate, but the jokes grew thinner with every mission. Each empty bunk was a silent rebuke, a reminder of the odds, of the cruel mathematics that measured a man's life in sorties and survival. At home, families waited. They clung to the sound of the postman's footsteps, to every envelope bearing a foreign postmark. Letters from the front were lifelines, crammed with stories meant to comfort and deflect. "I'm fine, Ma. The weather's turning, but the boys and I keep warm. Tell Dad the crops will be taller than me by the time I get back." Between the lines, mothers and wives learned to read the truth, the fatigue, the dread, the little hints of what was really being faced. And when the letters stopped coming, dread hollowed out the heart of every day. Some women received the telegrams. "The Secretary of War regrets to inform you." Words that shattered worlds in an instant. A wife in St. Louis, who'd lived for the thrill of her husband's postmarked jokes and memories, found herself clutching the yellow slip. Her life suddenly divided into before and after. A mother in Kansas put her son's last letter in a drawer and stopped going to church. In small towns and big cities alike, war's cruel math became real. A knock on the door, a priest's quiet visit, a flag folded into trembling hands. For the men who survived, the war left invisible wounds. Every new pilot in the squadron inherited the stories and the guilt of those who had come before. In the mess halls, faces changed. Some drank more, laughed louder, tried to outpace the ache. Others withdrew, finding solace in routine or in long, silent walks at the edge of the airfield. Even the bravest learned that courage and fear were two sides of the same coin. Survivors' guilt ate at the men who returned. They replayed the last moments of friends lost, wondering if a different maneuver, a sharper warning, a single change could have saved a life. They lived with the knowledge that fate was arbitrary, that sometimes the only difference between death and survival was the luck of a bullet's path or the timing of a flak burst. Lieutenant Tiny Harrison, who once wrote home with jokes and bravado, found himself unable to finish letters. "Ma, I can't explain it all, but I see their faces at night. Good men, all of them. I wish I could have done more." The weight was heavier still for those in command. Squadron leaders, forced to send boys barely out of school into the jaws of hell, learned the unspoken agony of watching their decisions play out in lives lost. They tried to comfort the wounded, wrote letters to grieving families, struggled to find meaning in the sacrifice. Major Edwards, a man hardened by years in the cockpit, found himself dreading the ritual of the morning roll call. Each missing answer was a sentence unfinished, a life left behind. The wives and mothers of fallen airmen formed their own quiet battalions, bound by loss and pride. Some wrote to the men who flew alongside their sons or husbands, asking for stories, for some scrap of memory to hold on to. In return, the pilots wrote back, sometimes honestly, sometimes with gentle lies, always with the knowledge that nothing could fill the void. "Your Jimmy was brave," one letter read, "and we all looked up to him. He saved my life over France. I owe him everything." Sometimes it was true. Sometimes it was just what needed to be said. Not all wounds were physical. Nightmares haunted many who made it home. Flashes of burning sky, the sound of engines failing, the memory of hands that slipped away. Some pilots woke in the night, drenched in sweat, reaching for controls that weren't there. Others struggled to find meaning in peacetime, their sense of purpose left somewhere over the fields of Europe. Yet even in the darkest corners, there was a stubborn resilience. The fallen were not forgotten. Every mission was flown with their memory in mind, a silent promise that their sacrifice would not be wasted. In the brief moments of rest between battles, men gathered to remember lost friends. They raised a glass or told a favorite story, laughter mingling with tears. In some small way, it kept the ghosts at bay. The Jug's growing reputation was not just a story of triumph, but a ledger of pain. German soldiers and civilians, too, learned to fear the Jug's roar, and among enemy camps, stories of its devastation spread like wildfire. Yet, in every whispered warning, there was a sense that something new had entered the war, a force driven by the memories and sacrifices of the men who had given everything. Victory demanded sacrifice. The world saw the headlines, the medals, the tales of glory, but it was the families and the survivors who carried the true burden. The price of legends was always paid in silence, by those who waited, those who mourned, and those who came home, changed. And as word of the Jug's power traveled across front lines and through enemy camps, it carried with it the memory of all who made it possible. The human cost was woven into every mission, every story, every legend. And still, the war pressed on, demanding more, asking always, who will pay the price when legends are made? They laughed. Now they pray they're not next. For the pilots of the Luftwaffe, Regia Aeronautica, and Imperial Japanese Air Service, the war began with confidence and bravado. They'd cut their teeth on the old planes of the 1930s, trained to believe their machines and skills were unmatched. Early in the conflict, stories about the American Thunderbolt were little more than a punchline. Fat, clumsy, and no match for the agile fighters of the Axis. The Germans, in particular, mocked the Jug's bulk and lumbering presence. The Italians traded jokes about how it must have been designed to haul freight, not fight. Japanese airmen scoffed at reports of its heavy frame, convinced it could never survive a dogfight in the Pacific's swirling, brutal air battles. But as the war ground on, and the Thunderbolt's presence grew, laughter slowly faded into unease, then into something like fear. Axis pilots who had once pounced eagerly on the P-47 began to speak of it with a wary respect, swapping stories in the shadowed corners of their airfields. "Don't attack from behind," a German ace cautioned, "or you'll find out what Acht Kanonen means." 8 guns, more than any single-engine fighter in the Luftwaffe's arsenal. Survivors told tales of their planes vanishing beneath a storm of American firepower, shredded in seconds by the Jug's deadly broadside. Enemy intelligence officers took note of the rising losses. After action reports filled with accounts of dogfights gone wrong, German and Italian fighters turned to scrap in the blink of an eye, pilots bailing out in terror, those who landed alive often too shaken to fly the next day. "I watched my wingman disappear in a flash," recounted Oberleutnant Fritz Engel. "One moment he was there, the next, nothing but smoke." Whispers spread among the ranks. Some insisted the Thunderbolt was invulnerable, its armor and engine able to absorb punishment no other fighter could withstand. Others claimed its pilots were reckless or even suicidal, willing to plow into danger because they trusted their machine would always bring them home. The Italian and Japanese airmen, who often faced Thunderbolts later in the conflict, learned quickly to adjust their tactics. "You must never fight the Jug at high speed," warned an Italian flight instructor, "for it will dive away and return with all its guns blazing." Japanese pilots who tangled with Thunderbolts over the Marianas wrote in their diaries of the strange, relentless enemy fighters, so heavy they seemed almost slow, but so difficult to destroy that some believed they wore an invisible shield. There were myths, too, stories passed from squadron to squadron, growing more fantastic with every telling. The Jug, some claimed, could return to base with half a wing gone, engines leaking oil, control surfaces shot to pieces, and still land safely. Rumors swirled that some Thunderbolts flew with secret armor, that their engines had been blessed by American priests, or that their pilots drank something to make them fearless. A Japanese ace, haunted by his own encounters, described the Jug as the storm that could not be broken. And yet, with fear came a grudging respect. Axis pilots could not deny the skill and nerve of the men flying these thunderous machines. They watched in disbelief as Thunderbolt squadrons dove into the thickest flak, strafed convoys and airfields, and clawed their way back through storms of gunfire. "Only a fool underestimates an enemy who has nothing left to lose," said an Italian captain after witnessing a P-47 pilot make a suicide run against a fuel depot. The war's brutality had forged a new kind of warrior, a pilot who trusted not just in his machine, but in his comrades, in tactics honed by failure and blood. Axis commanders responded as best they could. New orders were issued. Avoid direct engagement. Strike from above or below. Never approach a Jug alone. The Luftwaffe's tactical handbooks were revised, and flight leaders lectured their men on caution. Respect the Thunderbolt. Underestimate it, and you will die. The old jokes were gone, replaced by wary glances and a relentless search for new strategies. By 1945, the Thunderbolt's legend had spread across continents. Allied pilots intercepted enemy radio chatter filled with alarm and frantic warnings. "Thunderbolts! Achtung! Achtung!" The myth of the Jug's invincibility grew with every mission. Every battered fighter that limped home, every German, Italian, or Japanese ace shot down by a machine they once mocked. And as the war neared its end, enemy airmen came to see the Jug not only as a machine of war, but as a symbol of America's resolve. Its silhouette on the horizon meant the Allies were coming, with all the force and determination they could muster. The laughter was gone. In its place, a reluctant admiration. For many Axis pilots, surrender brought relief. Some even admitted to American interrogators that, given a choice, they would have flown the Jug themselves. The war had humbled all who survived it. The Jug's reputation, once dismissed, had grown into legend. Its thunder echoed not only in victory, but in the wary, haunted memories of those who fought against it. The war was ending, but the impact of the Thunderbolt, and the respect it commanded, would endure long after the guns fell silent. History remembers the victors, but never forgets the underestimated. When the final shots faded and the skies over Europe were silent once more, the story of the P-47 Thunderbolt seemed almost too unlikely to be true. For years it had been the workhorse, the juggernaut, lauded in the barracks, loved by those who survived in her, yet overshadowed in the grand sweep of victory by sleeker, flashier machines. The Mustang, with its elegant lines and long-range heroics, captured the public imagination. The Spitfire remained a symbol of defiance, but the Jug, the battered guardian of bombers and bane of enemy armor, slipped quietly into legend, its memory cherished by those who knew the truth of what it had achieved. In the years following the war, Thunderbolts were retired from service, their battered airframes sold for scrap or relegated to the bone yards. Some were flown home, serving as trainers, crop dusters, or simply left to rust on forgotten fields. To most of the world, they were just another tool of war, a name in the background of bigger, glossier headlines. Yet for the men who had trusted their lives to the Jug, the end of the war was not an end to the story. It was a reckoning, a chance to reflect, to honor the machine that had carried them through the worst the world could offer. In town squares and at veterans' halls, old pilots gathered, sharing stories that only they could truly understand. "She wasn't pretty," one veteran would say, running his hand along the faded paint of a museum-restored Thunderbolt, "but she got me home." That's all that matters. Restoration efforts began slowly, sometimes by passionate mechanics who stumbled across a forgotten fuselage in a barn, or by communities determined to preserve a piece of their shared past. In museum hangars, groups of volunteers worked tirelessly, scouring junkyards for rare parts, trading blueprints and photographs, pouring thousands of hours into resurrecting a legend. Each bolt tightened, each coat of paint was an act of reverence, a way of saying thank you to the old war horse that had been overlooked for too long. Interviews with surviving veterans brought new life to the Jug's story. Men who had grown gray with time but never lost the glint of mischief or courage in their eyes spoke of what it was like to trust everything to a machine so many had doubted. Some recalled the first time they unleashed all 8 guns, the thunderous kick, and the sudden, shocking power that changed the tide of battle. Others remembered moments of grace, an emergency landing in a muddy French field, a hand on a friend's shoulder, the bittersweet relief of seeing a familiar face after days behind enemy lines. As historians and filmmakers rediscovered the untold stories of World War II, the Jug's reputation began to rise. Technical experts pored over records and after-action reports, marveling at the P-47's resilience, its kill counts, and its unmatched ground attack success. Museum visitors paused before the squat, powerful silhouette, reading the placards that told of armor thicker than any fighter before or since, of 8 guns that could rip a train in half, of an engine that could fly home with holes you could fit your fist through. But the true legacy of the Jug lay not only in its numbers, but in the memories it carried. Veterans, asked what they remembered most, spoke not of medals or missions, but of the bond forged between man and machine. "She didn't care if you were scared," one said, "just that you kept your head, trusted her, and got the job done." Another, eyes shining with a mixture of pride and sorrow, added, "The jug never quit on me, not once. I couldn't quit on her." New generations, born long after the war's end, came to marvel at the jug's myth. Air shows across America and Europe welcomed the rare survivors, restored P-47s that roared back to life, their engines shaking the ground and their presence stirring something deep in the hearts of all who watched. Children stood in awe. Old pilots wiped away tears, and for a brief moment, history's long shadow grew warm with remembrance. The redemption of the Thunderbolt was slow, but it was sure. No longer was it merely the battle cow or flying milk can. The legends, once whispered in the aftermath of loss and laughter, became part of the fabric of victory. Historians re-evaluated the air war, giving the jug its due for the bridges destroyed, the convoys broken, the bombers saved, and the countless lives made possible by her stubborn tenacity. For those who had flown the jug, the true measure of victory was always personal, a survival paid for in scars and memories, a redemption won not in headlines, but in the simple act of coming home. Over Europe, the echoes of the jug remain. Every battered airframe resting in a museum, every flyover that rattles windows and hearts, every story told by an old man with a faraway look. All of it is proof that history, in the end, does remember the underestimated. The legacy of the P-47 Thunderbolt lives on, thunderous and unbowed, in the hearts of those who still look to the sky and remember the legend forged in lead. Some laughs fade, others echo through history. Decades after the last dogfight, the Thunderbolt still soars, no longer a harbinger of war, but a living memory cutting clean lines through a peaceful sky. In the quiet of an early summer morning, crowds gather at air shows across Europe and America, eyes skyward, hearts stirring as the unmistakable silhouette of the jug glints in the sun. The sound of its engine, a deep, resonant growl, draws gasps and cheers. The past made suddenly present in a roar that once struck fear and hope in equal measure. Below, families watch in awe, children waving miniature flags, veterans gripping the hands of grandchildren who will never know what it was to live through fire and loss. Nearby, restored jugs rest on the tarmac, lovingly polished by volunteers and mechanics, every scratch and rivet a story preserved. You can see it in the faces of the pilots who fly them now, men and women who train for years to master the old warbird, carrying not just a license, but a legacy. Historians and aviation buffs walk the flight lines, swapping tales with anyone who'll listen. They tell of the jug's days as a punchline and a savior, of men who went to war in her battered cockpit and came home with more scars than medals. Some speak softly, standing before memorial plaques, or beneath the wings of a museum Thunderbolt, tracing the names of those who never made it back. "He flew a jug," they say with quiet pride. And the meaning is clear. He was underestimated, doubted, and then became a legend. The meaning of the Thunderbolt endures, not just as a machine, but as a symbol. It stands for all who were overlooked, laughed at, or told they couldn't do the impossible. Its story is a tribute to resilience, to transformation, to the bonds of brotherhood forged in the crucible of war. Families of veterans keep faded letters and photos, smiling boys in flight suits, black and white images of planes on muddy airfields. Each is a reminder that courage isn't always loud or beautiful. Sometimes it's stubborn, battered, and exactly what the world needs. At every flyover, as the jug dips its wings in salute, you can feel the weight of history settling on the shoulders of the living. In interviews, the children and grandchildren of pilots say, "He never talked much about the war, but he always smiled when he heard that engine." Historians point to the jug as proof that strength doesn't always look the way we expect, that heroes sometimes come wrapped in armor and doubt. As the sun sets, casting long shadows across the runway, a final pass of the Thunderbolt echoes over the land it once helped to free. The crowd falls silent for a moment, the past and present united in gratitude and remembrance. There are fewer witnesses each year, but the story endures, passed from father to son, from teacher to student, from the wind-whipped fields of Europe to the endless blue above. Let us not forget the laughter that once filled the halls, the doubters, the jokes, the dismissals. Let us remember, too, how that laughter changed, how it was silenced, then reborn as awe, as gratitude, as legend. The Jug's story is not just about war or victory, but about what it means to persevere, to surprise the world, and to leave behind more than you ever imagined. Share the story of the Jug. Let no legend be forgotten.